Today, you're going to hear from two speakers, David Becker, who's Executive Director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research and the Election Official Legal Defense Network. He's also co-author of the book, The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie, and a portion of the proceeds from the book go to CEIR. CEIR is a nonpartisan nonprofit that conducts elections research and works with election officials from around the country and both sides of the aisle to support elections that voters should and do trust. We will also hear from Paige Alexander, the CEO of the Carter Center. The Carter Center was founded by former President Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalynn in 1982. It's a non-governmental organization. The Carter Center has helped to advance peace and health in more than 80 countries and has been a pioneer in international election observation. Paige Alexander joined the Carter Center as Chief Executive Officer in June of 2020. Born and raised in Atlanta, Paige has had a distinguished global development career with over 2 decades of experience spanning the government and nonprofit sectors. She has held leadership positions at 2 regional bureaus in the United States Agency for International Development, covering missions and development programs in 25 countries. Under her leadership, the Carter Center has become more engaged in election processes in the US and by focusing on work promoting democratic norms, averting potential election violence, and highlighting disinformation. We're pleased she's able to join us today to discuss the lessons she's learned from her international experience, how it applies to our own democracy, and what we should plan for as we look ahead to the 2024 election. Just a couple housekeeping items. To ask a question, you can do so at any time. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical questions, just raise your hand and we'll connect with you. Today's webinar is being recorded, and that recording, again, will be shared in the coming days. Thanks again for joining us, and now I'll hand it off to David Becker.
Thanks, Liz, and thank you all for joining. We've got great attendance at this webinar. I'm really appreciative. As Liz mentioned, I'm the Executive Director and founder of the nonpartisan nonprofit Center for Election Innovation and Research. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we work with election officials all over the country, in red states and blue states, Republicans and Democrats, to help them in their really important work to manage elections that voters should trust and do trust. And now more than ever, those are 2 very, very different things. The reality is that today, we run the most professional, secure, and verified elections that the United States has ever seen. We have more paper ballots nationally than ever. We have better, more accurate voter lists than ever before. We have more audits and verifications, independent verifications of the vote count than ever before. And yet, despite that, there have been losing candidates and grifters that surround them that have been deceiving voters into thinking the exact opposite. And it's produced somewhat of a crisis, particularly for the men and women all across the country of both parties that we rely upon to facilitate our democracy, who we rely upon to make sure that our voice is heard, the election officials and volunteer poll workers all around the country. They don't get famous, they don't get rich, but they perform such a really, really important function. And they have suffered over the last nearly 1,000 days, and it has been nearly 1,000 days since the November 2020 election, endless abuse and harassment and even threats, not just to themselves and their staffs, but sometimes to their families. In our work, as Liz mentioned, we do research about things like accurate voter lists and cybersecurity. We also run something I'm very proud of, the Election Official Legal Defense Network at EOLDN.org, if you want to check it out. It's a project that we have that pairs election officials with legal professionals or communications professionals who will assist them with any issues they have regarding their official duties when they need assistance. And more, we are getting requests from people who are working in elections, who are being harassed. And sometimes that harassment is actually coming from individuals who are charged with protecting them or overseeing them, their county boards. This is a real problem we're seeing going into the elections as people continue their attacks on our fellow citizens. And we're going to continue our work to support those citizens, the election officials around the country who are going to make sure that the 2024 election is secure, transparent, and verified, even better than 2020, because we're always improving thanks to the professionalism of these folks. One of the real privileges I've had in my work, I've watched from a distance at first, the work of the Carter Center, which does such an amazing work carrying on the legacy of President and Mrs. Carter to support international democracy, and in recent years has started looking inward at the United States domestically. And I've had the great privilege of working with Paige Alexander, who is a wonderful partner and someone who feels as passionately about American democracy as I do. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Paige, to say a few words.
Sure. Thanks, David. Thanks for including me on this. And yes, we have managed to bond since I took this job in June 2020. Suddenly you're a phone call and a text away on a daily basis. So thank you for all the work that CEIR and you have been doing. So really, after almost 40 years of working internationally, the Carter Center decided to focus on U.S. democracy. I came in June 2020, and I looked at the country then and saw 5 specific issues that really resonated with me. There was depolarization, there was swirling disinformation about the electoral process, there was the societal upheaval following the murder of George Floyd, and increasing distrust in institutions, elections, science related to COVID, which really predominated 2020. Excuse me, and therefore really distrust in each other. And the 5th was this risk of political violence that was suddenly very high and sadly came to pass. So these conditions, if we saw them in any other country, it would make us consider what the Carter Center could contribute. So we felt like it was critical to our international work that we do what we can here, because it was going to be hard to be credible in Tunisia and overseas if we weren't looking at our own backyard when it came to the 2020 elections. So looking at our own international expertise, the question was whether we had something to add to the challenges that the country was facing at the time. So look, the Carter Center has experience supporting elections in contexts of polarization and deep distrust. We've been doing it for decades now. We have experience with conflict mitigation in Sudan and Mali and Ethiopia. We have experience supporting good mental health policy because Rosalynn Carter started that 50 years ago. And we have a lot of experience strengthening the rule of law. So it is unusual that one organization touches on so many facets of the challenges that the U.S. had. And this is why the Carter Center decided to step into this area, because we figured one of many of these things would be relevant internationally, that we do internationally would be relevant domestically. So some of the tools that we've brought from our international experience, which I can talk about more later as we're talking, but nonpartisan election observation is practiced in almost every other country around the world. There are good voter education programs that we know are needed, so people walk into the polls understanding how the system works. We set up a candidate principles for trusted election, and that builds on this experience that we have doing party codes of conducts in other countries, and community and state-based efforts that we wanted to use to be able to refocus our collective attention on democratic norms and to help proactively respond to the potential for any violence that might arise in communities. So critical to all of these efforts, it's been working in a cross-partisan fashion as much as possible, and working really in close collaboration with partners like the Gerald Ford Presidential Foundation, Becker Institute for Public Policy, the McCain Institute, the Bush Institute. And so, of course, while 2020 was pivotal and volatile moment, we know that these challenges persist. And beyond these challenges, we need to look forward and about the work we're going to continue to do. I will say, just in closing, then we can have more of a talk about this. Our concern is that people need to have these conversations. And we have seen this overseas. And how do you bring this locally now? How do you bring this down to the community level and into the trusted voices and influencers that are outside of social media, but are just talking to your neighbor. And the Carter Center, when I walk into a place with a blue shirt on that says Carter Center, I'm assumed to be a Democrat, but we are nonpartisan at our core. And this is why we try to partner with other organizations. We don't want to be bipartisan because we're not the Democratic side of the Republican, but we are truly nonpartisan. And we're taking that way any place we are overseas, but not necessarily, in our own backyard. So those are the areas we're working on.
Yeah, Paige, you raised such an important point because I think it's easy, particularly for election deniers, people who are trying to weaken democracy, to try to delegitimize efforts because they want to label people as being partisans, as being Democrats or Republicans. And of course, President Carter was a Democrat in office, but you have really led the way partnering with, and I've personally been involved in things like your partnership with the Becker Institute in Houston, which has been incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
And I think that it's been so important because Republicans and Democrats, or people who are identified as that way, have really come together in this nonpartisan effort to strengthen democracy from the perspective that we want everyone to have confidence in the results, whatever those results might be, whatever the voters choose. Have you seen in your international work, and I actually don't know the answer, I haven't talked to you about asked this question before. So in your international work, have you heard more questions being raised about how strong American democracy is in the last few years? Because that used to be a foregone conclusion that would not, you wouldn't imagine it questioning whether American democracy was vibrant and strong. And I'm wondering whether overseas there are doubts now.
Well, so when I came to the Carter Center, I lived most recently in Europe, and I had been living in Amsterdam. And so being overseas from 2017 to 2020, there were a lot of questions about American democracy, but I was an American living overseas. And so hearing it through European ears and answering it was always a bit of a challenge. And then I get back here, and when, as I said, we're not going to be credible overseas. We've done elections in 40 countries, 115 elections in 40 countries, and they think that America is the pinnacle of democratic norms and processes. So when they see what is going on here, if we're not willing to look at it ourselves, then it does become a question. And so I think, all of my colleagues and the experts in this area, and, David Carroll and Avery Davis Roberts and all the folks that have been working on this for years, they recognize that we stand in good stead when we're in Tunisia or Zimbabwe or DRC or Sierra Leone. And people say, well, what about your own elections? And for us to be able to say, we're actually working on those and we're looking at those too, it carries a lot of credibility. So yes, the question does get asked.
One of the things that strikes me, I think, in both of our work is the reality about American elections is very different than the reality about most other elections overseas, where we have a very decentralized system. We don't have one national election. We have 10,000 little local elections that are happening on the same day. Whereas most places overseas do have some kind of central election authority. Most places, the ballots are, and this is something that's really mistaken by a lot of people, the ballots in most other countries are relatively simple. Sometimes they have as few as one race on the ballot, just a member of parliament. Whereas anyone who votes here in the United States knows it's very common to have dozens of races on a ballot that is multiple pages. And I think it's, this is somewhat of a question for discussion, but do you hear from overseas, like, why does it take America so long to count ballots and things along those lines? Because the reality is we actually do a pretty good job of that. It's just our ballots are so complex and we have so much decentralization that it would be impossible to count all of the ballots within a few minutes after the polls closing.
Yeah, and I think for me that was one of our bigger issues in 2020 is Americans are used to finding out the results of the election that night. And so that was our voter education focus was, you're going to have to wait. I mean, for those of us who remember 2001 or 2000, an election and waiting for 30 days for Florida to count the hanging chads, that was something that we are not used to experiencing. And so people understanding what it was going to take to get through the ballot counting and to get through all of that was a really important part of voter education. We have systems in place, and as you had said at the start, this was one of the most secure elections we have ever had, certainly in Georgia. And to be able to have that, but when you're trying to explain to people they're not little men in the machine who are changing your QR code, that there's still a paper ballot on the other side of it, that voter education is a really important part of what I think we try to push out. Questions are always going to be asked, why is it taken so long? Why is it so complicated? Why are you getting results from the most populous counties while you're not getting results from the smaller counties? And as soon as you start looking in and educating yourself of what it takes for someone to get the ballots from one place to another, it becomes clear why some of the timing is off. And the last election I had observed before observing here in Georgia was in Ukraine. And you're sitting the doors get locked when the polls close. The only people who are in there are the people who are allowed to be in there. You're watching the votes be counted, and it's a laborious process. It's a laborious process, and it's like watching paint dry. It is not exactly fun, but you see how it is working. And that's exactly what happens here in the States. So there are a lot more similarities than differences in many of those cases.
Yeah, I think that's right. And going back to kind of the unique expertise that the Carter Center has with observers and observation of elections, we do have this very long tradition in the United States of cross-partisan observation, where both the candidates and the campaigns are in there. There's the famous riot outside of the Detroit counting center where people were demanding to get inside to observe, where literally at that moment inside on the other side of the doors were 200 observers representing both campaigns, right, both political parties. That happens everywhere. Can you talk a little bit more about your work in because I think the nonpartisan observation definitely adds some. I have some experience in that from the Department of Justice side, where we would go in some places and it wasn't really nonpartisan per se. It was more legal observation done under the Department of Justice auspices. But I did that both in the Clinton administration and the W. Bush administration, and I've seen how important just being there and watching what's going on, learning about the different processes, while at the same time serving as kind of the fly on the wall, right? You're not interfering, you're just watching and you're taking notes so that you can report back to the proper authorities. Right. Talk a little bit about the work you're doing on that.
Sure. So the kind of nonpartisan observation the Carter Center undertakes is very different than election protection efforts or monitoring efforts that political parties do. So election protection is really focused on protecting the voting rights of individual voters when they show up and making sure that they're able to actually cast their ballot. Party monitors are watching to protect the interests of the candidate or the party that they're representing. And nonpartisan election observation is conducted the way the Carter Center does it, about being a champion for the process itself. So we're interested in making sure that the rules and the processes are followed, and that the things that work well in the process are highlighted, and that where there actually are shortcomings that can be addressed in the future. So it's about this continuous improvement of election processes that all stakeholders have the confidence that they are working as they should. I will tell you, this kind of observation is really trusted in recent surveys conducted by Public Opinion Survey in the Carter Center. It was sent to voters in Arizona, North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, and Nevada. And 57% of the voters stated that they would trust nonpartisan observers the most to make sure elections are conducted fairly and votes are counted accurately in comparison to major political parties. So that gives you an example of how nonpartisan, how this is respected. And, I can talk about how we did it in Georgia and how we did it in Fulton County. But again, I made the mistake when I came back from Europe. When you wear a blue Carter Center shirt and you walk in to be a nonpartisan observer, the blue had been usurped, and I was immediately assumed to be a Democratic Party observer. And so we made the change the next day, and everyone, wore regular shirts and just wore a Carter Center hat. And this year we wore purple when we were doing it, because it really does come down to some of these basic semantics of the color choice you have is assumed to be affiliated with the party. So trying to put ourselves in a nonpartisan space, it's hard because we're trained. We go in there with clipboards, we're ready, we know what we're looking for. And you get a lot of party observers who come in, they're not sure what they're looking for, but they're looking to catch something. And so part of that is this training that I think everyone, party and nonpartisan observers, need to have.
I think that's really important, because one of the things that that's been a tactic of those that are purveying disinformation and election deniers is to kind of engage in ad hominem attacks on people who are trying to uphold the process and delegitimize them by saying they're tribal or partisan. And that's been done even against people who are really noted leaders in the conservative movement and amongst Republicans. I think about people like Judge J. Michael Luttig, who was on George W. Bush's shortlist for the United States Supreme Court, and Ben Ginsburg, who was W. Bush's and Romney's campaign counsel, and Liz Cheney, whose conservative credentials absolutely can't be questioned. And it's been a tactic because, and unfortunately, somewhat of a successful one, where people like Representative Cheney lost her seat. But I wanted to kind of flip that and say, your Carter Center is based in Atlanta, of course, and you've been very active in Georgia. And Georgia has been a place that has very, very, very narrow, evenly divided, very narrow margins. And we've seen Democrats win some elections like President Biden and Senator Warnock. But we've also seen Governor Kemp and Secretary Raffensperger win by record margins. Can you talk a little bit about, because you've been really at the center of some of the work in Georgia, working with both parties and with kind of the elected officials and election officials. And can you talk a little bit more about what Carter's doing down in Georgia?
Sure. Well, so in 2020, when I came in, again, it's the middle of COVID, I managed to vote 4 times, when in the first 6 months that I moved here, because that's how many elections we had going. But there were also some faults. There were some fault lines. For example, Fulton County, the most populous county here down in Atlanta, there were long lines. June 15th, 2020, the lines were hours long. And again, it was a combination of COVID, it's a combination of poorly run polls, things just not being set up properly. So the concern over Fulton County was one thing that was looming large, that again, this is all local, all politics are local, and this was a local issue. But the Secretary of State's office wanted to do an election task force, a Secretary of State task force on elections, to look at all of the issues that we were going to be faced with in 159 counties. Fulton being one of them. And so we offered ourselves up for the task force, which was an important place for us to have a voice, because we were coming in, again, nonpartisan, independent, having had this experience overseas. We only go in when we're asked to assist. And so being asked domestically has not been something that we've done over the years, but we were asked to come on to the Secretary of State's task force. So we did that. We also looked at, as time went on, we did the risk limiting audit, which was something that everyone will remember happened in 2020. After we counted the votes, we had to recount the votes a couple of more times. And the election that they chose to recount for this risk limiting audit was Biden-Trump. And so we were able to do the election itself. Then we were the only nonpartisan observers allowed to do the risk limiting audit. And we were able to view all of that happening. It has morphed into what else can we do to be helpful? Now, the state election board, who was looking at Fulton County, decided that they needed more help. Someone was going to have to look at them in 2022. So the state election board, the performance review board, and the Fulton County Board of Elections, as part of this ongoing investigation for Fulton County, came to us and said in very short notice, can you deploy observers for 3 weeks of early voting, and then to deploy observers on election day, and then also to look afterwards at anything that came out of those issues. So we collected data from each of the polling places on whether the rules and procedures were followed, like ballot scanners being sealed and chain of custody procedures being followed. And we collected the data, we did a report, and that report helped them come to a close on the investigation, which had been 2 years in the making, that Fulton County was capable and competent to run their own elections. So this was a major issue that we were happy to be able to lean in on. But this happens, that's 159 counties in Georgia. This happens all through the United States in every county. And so these issues pop up, and where we can do work to be able to help with the transparency is sort of where the Carter Center stands on this.
Yeah, and I think Georgia is such a great example to talk about, because I mean the professionalism that's been built up in Georgia, very decentralized, second most counties in any state in the country. Most people don't realize that, 159 counties. Texas has 254. But there were so many changes to improve elections, as the professional election officials always try to do, even before COVID hit. I mean, it was in 2019, there was a change to move away from the paperless, all digital, direct recording electronic DRE voting that Georgia had for 2 decades. Most polling places in Georgia had not seen a paper ballot in 2 decades, since Bush versus Gore. And they implemented it in time for 2020, which was really important. You couldn't have studied the RLAs, the risk limiting audits, without paper ballots to do that. So they're constantly trying to improve. And I think this RLA research that you're doing in partnership with Fulton County really shows how much they know they're going to need to keep getting better, keep being more transparent, keep improving their processes. And I see also in Georgia's a place that you really see the false dichotomy of the voter suppression versus voter fraud debate materialize, where on the one hand, people are spreading lies or inflating the risks of voter fraud, whether it be from the voting machines, which are producing paper ballots, which are reviewed by voters and which are being audited, or voter fraud from, for instance, it was alleged that with 10,000 dead voters voted in Georgia in 2020, the Secretary of State investigated every single one of them and found 4. It was 4. Yeah, I just confirmed that. And of course, investigated those fully, as they absolutely should. But on the other hand, there's this allegation of voter suppression, and of course, particularly in states in the Deep South, issues relating to voter suppression, particularly of racial minorities, is very, very serious. But on the other hand, if you look at the objective facts in Georgia, we just issued a report on automatic voter registration in Georgia. It's one of the few places where Republicans implemented automatic voter registration administratively. And Georgia has one of the highest voter registration rates in the country, and has actually achieved parity with regard to voter registration and turnout between white and black voters, which is really remarkable if you consider where Georgia was 50 years ago. And you can see this. I mean, Georgia's in play for every race. I mean, it is, every voter there is, you can vote early easily, you can vote on election day easily, you can vote by mail easily if you want. I wonder if you agree with this. I often look at a state like Georgia. No state is perfect in how they run elections. I think we should say that. They're always trying to improve. But I often think Georgia is one of those states that if every state, it's near the top. I mean, if every state ran elections like Georgia, we'd be in pretty good shape.
Absolutely. Look, I'll be the first to say when I voted in November 2020, and then heard the aftermath of people saying, well, how do we know the QR codes aren't being changed from when they print out to when they're scanned through the machine? And look, I was thinking, how do I know that's not being changed? What's my comeback to that? Well, the paper ballot was the backup. And that was one of the reasons why the RLA then was so important, because again, there was not much space. I mean, there was some human error between the backup paper and what might have been in the QR code. But I sat in Fannin County, which is in North Georgia, and I watched them count every ballot, and I watched them hold up a mail-in ballot that it wasn't quite sure if someone had written somebody in, was the subjective nature of a written ballot then, oh, it went this way or it went that way. And when you redo it with a risk limiting audit, you're going to have a slightly different subjective nature. But the QR code and the paper ballots were matching, and the numbers at the end of the day matched. You, of course, are separating for PII and sensitive information, but they matched. And I think there was a study by Justin Levitt at Loyola Law School that there were 31 impersonation incidents between 2000 and 2014 out of 1 billion ballots cast.
Yeah.
So the idea that there are dead people on the voter rolls, all of that, it's been debunked, but it doesn't mean when that worm is put in your head about how do we know they're not changing things, or that you need an answer, because you need to be educated and understand how the process works from start to finish, how you go in. And again, it's like watching paint dry. You go in with your license, you prove who you are, you go behind the ballot box, you vote, you take it, no one else touches it, you scan it in, and that number will eventually compare to the paper ballot number when you do an audit. But it's shown that the system is working. And so for that, I'm incredibly grateful that the days of hanging chads are over, because this is as true to form as it can possibly be with 2 backups. So
I mean, it's really remarkable how much a lot of the doubts around elections that are being spread are really fueled solely by one thing, and that is the outcome of the election and whether you agree with it or not. I mean, for instance, in Georgia, there's no logical way to believe the 2020 election with paper ballots and audits, with Georgia having much more accurate voter lists, was flawed, but the 2016 election with purely digital ballots that couldn't be recounted was fine. Pennsylvania similarly went to all paper ballots between 2016 and 2020 and audited those ballots, and there's really no way to do that. And similarly, I mean, this is not just on one side. We saw not even close on the same scale, but there were some who questioned the outcome of the 2016 election without any evidence to back it up. And they were largely driven by something I think we can all understand, which is sincere disappointment in the outcome. I mean, everyone experiences that when their candidates lose, but to take that extra step and then attack our fellow citizens who've done everything they can to run secure elections is really troubling. And
I will say, because you touched on voter registration, President Carter, actually, when he was Governor, Carter was the one who put voter registration in the high schools. And so here in Georgia, you registered to vote when you turned 18. And now when I come in to get my license, my kid registered to vote when they got their license. So there are ways to make voting, applying to be able to vote easier. And I think we've actually cracked that nut here in a major way.
Yeah, I was just talking to Gabe Sterling, who I think everyone knows, who's the COO of the Georgia Secretary of State's office. And he was saying something I thought was just so important. And which something I believe very much, which is that they want all of the eligible voters to register and vote. They're not scared. They want to have a battle of ideas. They want to have to work to persuade voters, and they don't shy away from that at all. It's kind of how a democracy fundamentally must function. So for instance, one of the things our study on Georgia automatic voter registration found was that in 2020, thanks to automatic voter registration, building on the work of President Carter when he was governor, the passage of the National Voter Registration Act and motor voter, online voter registration, joining ERIC and then AVR, all of those built up to the point where in 2020, Georgia had 98% of its eligible citizens registered, which was near very, very top, if not the top. That's remarkable. And black registration rates and white registration rates tracked each other, which is really a testament to the work that they've done and allows Georgia to be kind of the battleground for ideas that it should be.
Yeah, there's a joke here that's not funny to some of our southern neighbors, but Georgia always says at least there's Alabama and Mississippi. When you look at where Georgia ranks on a lot of different charts, Georgia's high up there on voter integrity and our ability to run this process. So that's something we're pretty happy about.
Yeah, no, I mean, especially it's not just compared to the states of the old Confederacy. I mean, it does very well when you compare them to the states of the old Confederacy, but compared to states all across the country, red states and blue states. I mean, again, For someone who's never lived in Georgia, I actually have worked in Georgia quite a bit, and I know Georgia quite a bit, as you know, Paige. And I was in charge of Georgia when I was at the Department of Justice, and I litigated a major case against, at that time, the Georgia Democrats during the 2000 redistricting cycle under the Voting Rights Act. But the Georgia has really embraced the 21st century and has and the fact that it is incredibly easy for voters. I mean, this doesn't mean there aren't sometimes lines and hiccups. There are 100%. And it doesn't mean every law is perfect, that it isn't. There are laws that I don't like there's laws other people don't like. But in general, for most voters in Georgia, they're going to find that they can vote early in person or by mail pretty darn easily. And, you know, and if they vote by mail, their mail ballots are going to be verified multiple times when they ask for them and when they return them by professional election officials all over the state.
Yeah, and I'll say on that, you know, on top of having President Mrs. Carter voting in Plains, Georgia, absentee, having my 90-year-old parents also do the same, I've seen how this is working and how it works in Georgia, and I'm cognizant of the fact that President Carter and the Carter-Baker report that was done in 2005. Keep in mind, 2005 was like before we even knew we all needed phones to, we didn't have phones at our fingertips. So it was a long time ago. But when they said, watch the space for mail-in balloting for potential fraud, that was 2005. Now you've got Oregon that only does mail-in balloting. So we figured this out. Election administrators have figured it out in a period of time, how to do things and keep it transparent, legitimate, and a paper trail that you can then follow. And so the things that we worried about in 2005 that came out of that report were important. And that's why we revisit it on a regular basis with the Becker Institute to talk about it. But I think that that we've come a long way through the different processes. And again, every state, Oregon does it one way, Georgia does it a different way, New York a third way. We're learning. But for us at the Carter Center, every state is like a separate country. And so when you have over 10,000 jurisdictions for voting, it makes it very difficult to treat every state the same, just like we don't treat every country overseas the same. So we are looking separately at how we can do work in Arizona and North Carolina and Georgia and Florida, because it's just not every place is like Georgia and not every place is like any other state in the US.
That's such a key point. I mean, states that have done a lot of mail voting, and it's interesting because Georgia had about in 2020, because of COVID, about a quarter of all voters voted by mail in Georgia. That was a very high watermark for Georgia, maybe more like a third. It was a very high watermark for Georgia. But in 2022, without COVID, it kind of settled back down at just under 10%, which was where it historically had been in the past. And there are other states, particularly in the West, where there's a culture of mail voting that has been really followed. And you mentioned this in 2005, mail voting in places like Oregon was still relatively new. Washington hadn't gone to all mail voting by then, and it went there shortly thereafter. And now it's been decades. And to build up that culture and the voter education that goes along with it.
Right.
Talking about Arizona, Arizona was one of those states that saw very few changes due to COVID because they had a culture of mail voting that had been built up over time. And so they saw just a little bit more mail voting, from 85% to maybe 90% in 2020 as a result, whereas states like Georgia, which were mail voting wasn't new to Georgia, but it wasn't part of the culture of voting like you see early in-person voting, which is a really big part of the culture in Georgia.
Right. Yeah, I think, drop boxes, early voting, all of these are elements that came to light during COVID that we were able to expand. And actually, in fact, SB 202 here in Georgia codifies some of it. And there's good and bad. And look, we've gone through that bill with a fine tooth comb. And again, there's good and bad. But the fact that some of these things have been codified to make voting easier and still safe is a really important part of what we wouldn't have had before COVID. We wouldn't have had all the drop boxes, and we have fewer now, but we still have them. And people are able to vote without, in many states, the no excuse absentee ballot voting that was codified even after COVID. And so those are the areas that people should be able to vote. It should be secure and it should be safe and it should be transparent. And so it's hard when you look at the arguments of, voter suppression, when people are challenging election and one side is saying voter suppression, and the other side is saying that the votes weren't counted properly. It's hard to have both. The only thing that brings sides together, and again, going back to the fact we were wearing a blue shirt, that just put us in a blue corner. It didn't, we were still able to be in there, but to claim that we are nonpartisan and to make that point and to be able to be on the floor, it's just the reaction that people have against us when we were wearing blue shirts is very different. It's like the election administrators now. I mean, we're losing 1.5 administrators a day. I mean, how many have we lost and what is 2024 going to look like when you have people, you mentioned Arizona, so you have people like Bill Gates, there was a wonderful article in the Washington Post where he admitted to the PTSD and the trauma that he has from friends attacking him for the work that he was doing. And when you have that, I mean, whether I've got a blue shirt and someone's attacking me, claiming I'm something I'm not, or whether you have someone just simply out there counting ballots and they go out to their car and they've got nasty notes on it, or they get harassed, people are doing this because they feel it's their civic obligation. And if you have a question about it, then get in the process and be part of it so you can be trained and you can understand what it looks like from start to finish, because it's not as questionable once you know what it is. It's very questionable when you're sitting outside and picking apart what you think it might be, but take the chance to learn.
I think, and I know we're going to get to questions, Liz, but one of the things I've seen in some of the questions is there's a term I learned recently. It was rage farming, which is on social media and other places. There are people whose product they create in our market economy is anger.
Yeah.
The sole job they do is to try to get people across the political spectrum angry about something. And one of the key ways we're seeing that is angry that that elections are supposedly being stolen. I've seen this. It has been much more predominant on the right now, but it exists to a significant degree on the left as well. Not equivalent at all, by the way. I don't want to suggest it is. It's not 50-50, but it's not 100-0. And so I think one of the things I've seen in some of the questions is, what really great questions like, what can we do? And I think one you just raised is volunteer to be a poll worker. That's number one. That is that if you'll do that, you'll see it, you'll see the inside, you'll see how many checks and balances are in place that make it impossible to steal a national election. That has been built up over time. It's been really wonderful to see the professionalism of election officials. But the other thing I often say is, be a skeptical media consumer. There are people out there who are trying hard to get you to doubt outcomes, particularly outcomes that you're already predisposed to doubt because you don't like them. Right. And we get that. I mean, being disappointed in the outcome is absolutely your right as an American to do that, and then to work for to change the outcome in the next election. I hope everyone does that, but be skeptical when you see media saying that elections are being stolen because of fraudulent voting or because the machines are hacked, because those things are likely not true. Those people are likely trying to farm your rage. And there are so many checks and balances in place, and those checks and balances are stronger than they've ever been. And in 2024, they will be stronger still. And I guarantee you in 2028, they'll be even better.
Yeah, and I would say, sadly, disinformation about elections is not a problem unique to the United States. And what's important to remember is that disinformation, as we talk about it today, it's not new. It's just faster and easier to consume when it comes through social media. And almost all of us are carrying devices that allow us to tap into it at any point in time, and through our smartphones or computers. So I would say there are three things that we are seeing in our work related to disinformation and misinformation and malinformation, and that directly affect the electoral environment. First, where you look changes, what you read, what you hear, what you watch. I have 3 kids, and so they're grown kids, and they're always sharing information with me saying, is this real? Is this true? You really have to think about the information ecosystem which you're in, and it can be very different from person to person. And those become these echo chambers. So, our takeaway has been that monitoring and measuring social media, you can't just do it on one platform. It's incomplete. You've got to track all of social media and look at commentary across Facebook, Twitter, Truth Social, TikTok, YouTube, because you will see where some of the arguments just feed off each other. And I don't know how you best plug in to change that narrative, and not to change the narrative because you don't like the narrative, but to change it to try to add something truthful into it. We also really need to understand the poster's intent to deceive. That's really central to the definition of disinformation. So, for example, if you were trying to cover up a scandal so that a company doesn't have to pay damages, that's intentional disinformation. But if you're lying about a political opponent's voting record to win a local election, that too. But if you're lying about it, you can find the truth and someone else can post the truth. That's when the conversation begins. So that happens hopefully on social media, but not often, because once you're in your own echo chamber, it just continues.
Yeah, and along those same lines, and Liz, I know we got to get to questions.
Sorry.
No, this is great. We as usual, Paige and I could probably talk for 2 hours just about this stuff. I mean, be very skeptical of claims that are easy to make on social media, but they're either individuals refuse to put them before a court to be scrutinized and cross-examined, or courts, including courts appointed by the other party, whatever that party is, reject those claims as being not sufficient. And I think a great example of that, for instance, there were claims made by a debunked documentary about massive voter fraud through ballot harvesting in Georgia and other places. And the Georgia law enforcement, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Attorney General and others, asked the makers of that documentary for all evidence of crimes allegedly being committed in Georgia. They refused to respond to that. They subpoenaed them for that information. They refused to respond to that. And now they brought a court case saying we're going to compel you to bring any evidence of alleged claims. So you can't just put it in a fake documentary. You can't just spread them on social media. And I suggest everyone across the political spectrum, the courts have held up remarkably well, and we should respect the rule of law. It's a key element of a democracy. I'm sure you've seen that overseas, Paige. And I think that it's like that is when courts might not always look, their court decisions, a lot of us disagree with. There's no question about that. But usually, and I say this as a lawyer, when your evidence has to be subjected to cross-examination by someone on the other side, the holes in that evidence will be clear. And that's why we're seeing lawyers being subjected to disbarment now. We're seeing cases being filed, and we're seeing sanctions being issued against frivolous claims. I think that's a really constructive element, and I hope people pay more attention to that rather than the social media noise that's often promoted. Liz, do you want to? There's been many, but I'll let you pick.
We have lots of great questions, so I want to thank everyone for submitting the questions that they have already. Just a reminder that you can ask even more in the Q&A box. So our first question sort of sums up a trend in questions that we receive from a lot of people. So what is the reality of threats to democracy in the US versus hype on the news? Are we being too pessimistic about the state of our democracy? We've overcome great obstacles in the past. Can you two respond to that?
You want me to go first?
Okay. Why don't you go first?
So I often, when people ask me about what I'm worried about, I kind of separate it into 2 categories. I am not worried about how well the election in 2024 and subsequently will actually be run. I think even with the turnover in election officials, in some of the attrition, Paige, you mentioned this, it's really unfortunate. But these election officials are as good and has been tested under fire as any in American history. They're outstanding. Republicans and Democrats all over the country, the ones who have stayed, and that's the majority, it's a calling for them. This is something they believe deeply in. And so if you're a voter and you're worried that your vote is going to be easy to cast and counted appropriately, you shouldn't be. It's going to be. The thing I am worried about And I should also say one other thing. I'm largely confident that the courts are going to continue to hold. I think the courts, again, Republican and Democratic appointed judges have generally done pretty well in the area of democracy. I am worried that the lies in a post-election period by losing candidates who refuse to accept the will of the voters could lead to anger fueled by grift that could eventually lead to political violence. And again, this is not hypothetical. Paige, you alluded to this. This happened on January 6th. That's what, and that was focused on one place on one day. You can imagine that being much worse and being focused on a variety of different places on a variety of different days, fueled by lies that our fellow citizens, the people who you literally, whose children, your children go to school with, are somehow engaged in a massive conspiracy of hundreds of thousands of people, half of one party and half the other, to steal elections, and that nobody is talking. That's very, very dangerous. And so I worry about that post-election period quite a bit.
Yeah, and I would say, our concern is that most Americans really don't have access to accurate information about the electoral process in their particular voting jurisdiction. And so the responsibility to educate voters on the process really falls to these county election officials. And they need more resources and time to conduct this significant voter education opportunities for people to learn. So, when an American doesn't know how their vote gets processed, just like overseas, they worry, and they're more likely to be provided false narratives or to come up with false narratives. And we've not done a great job on civic education or voter education. We talk about these election administration officials. We're losing them at a rate of 1.5 a day since 2020. And when you don't have them, you're missing a whole opportunity for people to fully understand how voting works. And they have been subjected to harassment. And we at the Carter Center have a mental health resource guide for them. And that, to me, has been the biggest surprise at the uptick and usefulness and appreciation that these election administrators feel for having a mental health resource guide. Everyone is subjected to somebody and a family member or friend who's gone through a mental health crisis since COVID, especially. And when the person sitting next to you, when you're working 15 hours a day with the poll being open for early voting and for weeks on end with early voting and day of voting and counting it and being harassed, you need to be aware that the person sitting next to you is actually going through a crisis because they are getting harassed, and you might be able to handle it one way. But that is the backbone of American democracy, are people who are willing to put themselves out there and run this process. And if we start questioning our neighbors and the people who live in the counties, it's not like big Washington's coming in to run the election in Fannin County. These are local folks. And if you're questioning them because you don't have the education, the voter education information to understand how it's working, that's not their responsibility. And so I really worry about the polarization that has happened and the fact that there has been violence breaking out for reasons that are just lack of education. So that's, I feel like we were on the precipice in 2020 and we were looking over it, and we came back from it, both because the courts were the pendulum swing of the courts recognizing that some of these false narratives were so detrimental, but also we've only stepped back from it. We're not off the cliff. We just stepped back from it. So 2020 gave me some hope that 2024 won't be as angst-ridden as 2020. But again, it's on the backbone of these officials, and that's what worries me. We need to help them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me about all this is we know from efforts that have been confirmed by our adversaries overseas, adversaries who are autocratic, who want to weaken global democracy, that they want nothing more than to pit citizens of a democracy, American citizens, against each other. They want us to divide ourselves because they have been unsuccessful in dividing us. And unfortunately, we see this in these attacks on, literally hundreds of thousands of Americans that we rely upon to run our elections, who work really hard to do this. And I think it goes back again to the point you raised earlier, which is, please, if you're listening to this, go volunteer to be a poll worker. We are at a kind of a transition period because COVID rendered a lot of the older poll workers we rely upon, who are more vulnerable to the virus. A lot of them had to stop volunteering, and so there are a lot of opportunities, particularly for younger people, to volunteer. And again, once you see how the process works from the inside, it is really hard to think that there is some kind of nefarious conspiracy going on that is delivering national elections to the loser. That's just not happening.
Okay, everyone, we are out of time, but thank you so much for logging on. A couple accounts for you to follow before we hop off. Follow David on Twitter at Becker David J. Also, hot off the presses, David is launching a new series of short videos to combat misinformation throughout the 2024 election cycle. You can check those out on YouTube. They're going to be launching very soon. Follow the Center for Election Innovation and Research there. You can also follow the Carter Center on Twitter at Carter Center. Thanks so much again for joining us.
And Liz, can I just interject? There were a lot of questions about the Carter Center's great work overseas that we didn't get to. And Paige, maybe if you're up for it, maybe we can do another one of these at some point and really
love to
dig into that, because I honestly, that's the stuff I would like to learn about more as well.
Yeah, we've got a lot of upcoming overseas elections, so we'd be happy to talk about that always.
Good. So follow both organizations because the conversation will continue.